校长、各位贵宾、各位师长，大家好。那么今天我们很高兴校长亲自来到我们现场，想讲几句话来欢迎我们的包彼得教授。所以我们一开始，我们先请我们的李校长来讲几句话。
包教授，还有王院士，还有杨主任，还有所有今天参加我们讲座的贵宾，大家午安。国际汉学是我们政大一个很重要的发展方向。那这个国际汉学讲座，又叫做罗家伦国际汉学讲座哈，是希望能够借由邀请国外非常知名的国际汉学的学者到台湾来，把他们研究的经验带到台湾，透过这一系列的讲座，还有之后集结起来的书籍，希望能够带动政大甚至是台湾整个汉学研究的整个的发展。好，今天我们这次很高兴，非常高兴邀请到哈佛大学讲座教授包彼得教授哈 Peter Paul， 非常非常感谢他。我跟他其实在好几年前，大概7、8年前，曾经在澳门曾经见过很高兴这次又有机会来聆听他的演讲。那非常谢谢他来给我们做这第3场的演讲，也有机会跟大家一起来聆听他在国际汉学上的经验哈。那包教授过去在数位人文，除了他是在汉唐思想史之外，在数位人文的领域，特别是在地理资讯系统相关的研究，也都非常的知名。很高兴今天有这个机会跟大家一起参与，也祝大家今天下午有一个非常愉悦的体验。谢谢。
校长，我们待会跟我们小小仪式，校长上证书。大家跟着包彼得。
是。
到中间来。到中间来。
在那里好。好，谢谢。
要不要脱一下口罩？这是好意思。好，谢谢。好，那我们非常谢谢校长帮我们颁的聘书。那今天是我们正式的演讲的最后一场。那上一场演讲，包彼得教授以经世之学为主轴，谈论从宋到明，那么各家各派对经世之学的看法。那今天他要转另外一个方向，就是从文学家、文学创作的角度来看这些文学创作者他们怎么样来看待他们的学问。然后他会做比较分析，把这个文学方面的作品跟前面所讲的经世之学还有道德的学问那么做一个比较分析。那今天的演讲应该也是一样非常精彩可期。好，我就不再多占用时间，那我们欢迎包彼得教授。
谢谢杨教授，谢谢李校长的介绍。那我今天还是跟上一次一样，是给大家这个中文稿子，然后我自己用英语讲。大家都知道我的汉语是不行的而其实这个稿子比我流利的多，对，我英文还是比我汉语好，所以也是可是我这3场的讲座都是关于可以说是宋代到明末17世纪的做学问传统，学术传统，而我的基本的我的前提是我们人类都是至少有5个经验的领域，而每个经验的领域有它的关联的学术传统。我上一次是讲到这个经世之学，经世之另外一个字the learning of。经世之学的传统，我今天要看可以说是文学跟道德思想，儒学的道德思想跟佛教的道德思想，看他们是不是政治而已。那么我提到 I have to go back to speaking English again. Good, okay. When I use the word politics, I don't mean government. I mean instead the idea that we compete with each other for authority, to establish a reputation, to tell other people what they should do, and that this happens in government, of course, is where the word politics comes from, but it happens in all areas of life, right? And so today, as I talk about literary traditions and traditions of moral thought, I want to draw your attention to two things. The first is that people within literary traditions, of Wenxue traditions, if you will, cultural traditions, establish their own reputation with reference to people in the past, right? By rejecting them, by choosing them, by saying some are good, some are bad, but they define themselves with reference to a tradition. The second thing is that they look at their own tradition and are critical of others. So people who particularly, as you'll see, people who are engaged in moral thought are extremely critical of those who make their reputations for literary achievement. This does not mean that a person cannot be active in many fields. If you think about somebody like Huang Zongxi, right, who does both a history of moral thought, Mingwu Xuan, Song Yuan Xuan, right, who writes on government in Jingshi Zhixue with the Mingyi Daifang Lu, and who writes on literature with his anthology, the Ming Wenhai, or think in the 12th century, 13th century, in the Song dynasty, Zhen Dexiu, who is a famous Dao Xuejia, a Confucian moralist, but also does Da Xue Yeni about government, right? And does Wenjiang Zhengzong about literature. But it is true that somebody like Zhen Dexiu has a position within Dao Xue from which he looks at other activities, looks at government, and looks at literature. Now, the people I'll be talking about today are down here, right? I'm going to be talking about three people in northern Song, right? Cheng Yi, and then a Buddhist, the Mingjiao Qisong, and Su Shi, the famous literary person, and then southern Song, mid-Ming and late Ming, right? One of the points, of course, I'm making is that although all fields exist, no one can deny that culture exists, that language exists, that ideas and beliefs exist, right? There's no one right way to pursue them, right? You have that phrase, 一致而百虑，殊途而同归. My view is 天下殊途而不同归, right? And that does mean that I am, if to use Chinese phrases, I prefer 分裂 to 统一. I prefer 差异 to 一致, right? I prefer 断裂 to 连续性, right? And I've been criticized for this, and you may criticize me too, and particularly in mainland China, where I've been told that my way of thinking is typical Western thinking. But what I want to show you today is, in fact, that this critical view of division, of political view in learning, is actually quite common throughout Chinese history, in the period I'm going to be talking about. So let's begin with Cheng Yi, right? And if you look in your 稿子, the 中文稿子, 你可以 make a slide 在右边下面，可能你们看不到，可是是第三个 slide, right? So you can follow along like that. Now, Cheng Yi is looking for a key term, his 关键词, so to speak, his overarching, tie it all together word. And the word he has, right, is li. His contemporaries at the same time had other terms. We know from Shaoyong, right, that Shaoyong said shu, number, right? The idea that they're numerical systems comes first. And Cheng Yi said, no, it's li. Zhang Zai said it's qi, right, that holds everything together. And Cheng Yi said, no, it's li. right? So they're all looking for one big term, the idea that one term can explain everything, hold it all together as a common concept. And what's interesting for Changyi is that he takes traditional words like Dao and Xing and says, 这个是什么意思呢？就是理, right? That the word li actually is what, when Confucius talks about Dao, when Mengzi talks about Xing and Xingshan, they're actually just talking about li, right? The same thing. So the question then is, what's li? Right? And I argued the other day that when we think about li, right, li is that which gives things its structure, its process, its order, and defines its possible function. You know, the phrase in Chinese, the things, 无有本末，实有终始，知所先后，则今道矣, from the Da Xue. That's, in some sense, a way of talking about li. The English term coherence for li is attractive because it says everything has its li, everything has its coherence, but coherence of one thing is the same as the coherence of another thing. At the level of abstraction, coherence is always the same, right? It's like a mathematics problem. If you get it right, it's coherent. And that coherence is no different from the coherence of another problem, even though the problems are different, right? So that's why I've accepted my own teacher's definition, translation and definition of li as coherence in English. Changyi is interested in li for another reason. Li, more than any other term, is about how things are connected together. And if you think about Dao Xue thinking, right, they're interested in connectivity. They're interested in how things are connected together. They are the opposite of me, right? I am interested in how things are different. They want to find connections and unities. Right? But Changyi, in talking about li, is different from his brother, Cheng Hao. Because Cheng Hao falls back on this notion of tiandu wang wei yi, right? Which Wang Yangming will later adopt as well, right? And Changyi is really much more about 高无知知, 穷理精心. It's much more of an intellectual enterprise, right? Look now about how Changyi is going to position himself and his brother. This is still slide number 3. On the Mubiao, for the grave for Cheng Hao, Changyi writes this: 周公孟，圣人之道不行；孟子嗣，圣人之学不传。道不行，百世无善之；学不传，千载无真如。 That's a claim to make, right? 无真如，天下茫茫焉；莫之所至，人有思而天理灭矣。 Right? So we have the claim that's being made here is that despite the fact of Han Dynasty rule and Tang Dynasty rule and Weijin Nancha rule, right? There have been no Zhenru for 2,000 years, right? Or 1,500 years, let's say, since Mencius. And we, Changyi, Cheng Hao, we are my brother, and also me, of course, for Changyi, we have rediscovered it. That is a claim about tradition, which wipes out everybody else before you, right? That's politics. That's politics. 所以我在政治大学很高兴可以用这个政治这个词。But I don't think 政治大学 had the idea that I have of 政治。So on one hand, Changyi is redefining the Ru tradition. On the other hand, he's looking out at his contemporaries and saying, there's something wrong here. People aren't following our tradition correctly. Why? It's not because of 佛学. That's not his argument. His argument in 言之所好和学 is that 言之所好和言会所好的是什么学呢？就是为圣人之学. And why don't people today do 圣人之学 is because they are doing 文字, because they're doing 文章, because they're doing examination learning. Right? This is the time when examination learning, 科举之学, has become so popular. Right? And So he looks and he says, all these people doing one, it's bad for cultivation of morality. And that's his argument here, right? So one Hai Dao Fo, his student asks, and he says, Hai. That's right. It does harm. And it does harm because if you pay attention to writing well, you're not paying attention to cultivating your moral nature, your moral awareness. Right? And he says at one point in another place, he says, if you talk about all the Wenzhang through history, 有之无所补, 无之没所缺. If you don't have him there, it doesn't matter, right? So that is this rejection of this. And that's my point, right? The intellectual traditions in China, and not only in China, have proceeded through a redefinition of tradition, of your own tradition that you claim for yourself, and a rejection and an attack on other people's, right? Politics, RE. Right? Now we're on slide 4. Now, Mingjiao Qisong, famous 11th century monk, right? He also believes strongly in moral practice, and he also attacks Wenxue. His famous work, Fu Zhao Bian, right, is actually a claim that Buddhism is good for society. But he is also involved in redefining Buddhism, right? His book, Chuanfa Zhengzongji, right, is a book that argues that Chan Buddhism comes directly down from Shakyamuni. Well, we all think that that's what Chan Buddhism says. Yes, but at the time, Tiantai Zong, right, Tiantai Buddhism criticized Chan Buddhism exactly for that false claim. They said, you guys are making it up, right? And so he is defending Chanzong against other kinds of Buddhism, just like Chang'e was defending his vision of being a Ru against other kinds of being a Ru. He's still very much, right, in the tradition of Buddhism, and he regards Qing, human emotions, as an encumbrance, as a problem, and this is something that already in the 11th century for our Cheng, for example, Chang'e, Cheng Hao, and others, had come to be rejected. They saw that, in fact, Qing were necessary. For Hanyu, the danger, it's true, Chang'e, Cheng Hao were very anti-Buddhism. Zhang Zai was anti-Buddhism. But for Qisong, the threat is not from Chang'e, Cheng Hao, those people. The threat is from Guwen Yunlong. The threat is from people who are writing in the Guwen style, who see themselves as offering an alternative. And so he writes a long set of essays called Fei Hanyu. Why does he have to Fei Hanyu? Because Hanyu has been held up as the model of Guwen writing, of Wenzhang, and of engaged literary politics, engaged social responsibility. And who is the person who most promotes Hanyu? Ouyang Shou. And in Ouyang Shou's 3 essays, Ban Lun, he talks about how to move Buddhism out of society, to get rid of the influence of Buddhism on society, and to have, in fact, new Confucian notions be dominant for the lives of everyday people. And Qisong's Fu Zhao Bian is, in fact, an attempt to defend the role of Buddhism in society, and that's why he includes Fei Hanyu as part of his essays. And in fact, in many ways, he writes in the Guwen style himself. But his Guwen, his Renwen, if you will, is very different. He has somebody comes to him. Qisong had many literati, Shiren followers. And somebody says, everyone's going to the capital. 大家都去京师，他们是带他们的古文来，古文文章. And he says, and what do you think about that? And he says, going back to the origins of writing, of Guwen writing, it was about how people showed Ren and Yi, right? And managed policy and institutions. Good writing is about moral principles, he explains. Ouyang Shou, his is Yanwen, 不是Renwen, right? He is just talking. His is just words. Order in the world depends upon human Ren one, and Ren one, Yen one is simply an expression of that. But what is Ren one? Ren, Yi, Li, Zhi, Xin, right? That's not Ouyang Shou. So, again, my same point is being made. Now, I'm going to spend in this lecture today, I'll be talking a little bit extra about the people in Wenxue, Su, to begin with Su Shi, and I'll be ending with Feng Menglong in the 17th century. And I'm spending more time on them in part because I think in 可以说是在中国思想史方面, literary figures have been largely neglected, right? Not only that, if we look at Huang Zongxi's the Ming Yuan Xuan Song Yuan Xuan as Chen Zuwang developed it. If we look, where is Su Shi? Where is Wang Hanshi? They're in the very last chapter. They're taken out of their role in history and put at the very end and say, this was a wrong turn, the wrong way. In their own times, they were not the wrong way. Okay, so here are two views of Su Shi. The first is from Su Shi himself. It's from Li Zhi's Shi You Tanji. And this is recording, he says, what Su Shi said to him and his students one day. 文章之人, 一在明史之事上有诸门. We, the responsibility, this is slide 6, responsibility for literature lies with literati who, famous in their time, make an alliance with each other. Then this way will not decline. Today, at the height of great peace, literary literati are appearing one after another. The goal is to make the literature of a single time have someone to take as an ultimate authority. In the past, Ouyang Shou turned this responsibility over to me. Therefore, I have made an effort. Later, the leadership of the Alliance of Literature will be charged to you gentlemen, just as it was to me. Very clear politics of literature, right? Saying, we have this tradition, Ouyang Shou passed on to me. There were many other people at the time who were famous for their writing. Hardly Ouyang Shou alone. Wang Anshi was another famous Guwen writer. Sima Guang was a very influential writer as well. But Su Shi is picking out a tradition and saying, this is our tradition. Okay, so that's one part of it. But then, Qin Guan writes this. Somebody writes to Qin Guan, because Qin Guan is Su Shi's Dizi, right? The follower of Su Shi. Somebody writes to Qin Guan and says, 你的二叔他们的文章那么好，那么好. And it's all about Wenjiang. And Qin Guan says, oh, no, you got it wrong. Right? 最深与姓名色德之际. Right? They aren't just about Wenjiang. The way of the Sus is most profound in matters of innate nature and apprehending it in oneself. Next is the fact that their capabilities are sufficient to be major responsibilities, right? And their knowledge is sufficient to still meet what is far off, and right? As for their Wenjiang, as for their Ilun Wenjiang, right? Theirs are among the most unpolished presently circulating. You judge the Sus, yet your discussion is limited to Wenjiang. I gather you wish to honor the Sus. In fact, you end up degrading them. We today, of course, think of Su Shi as famous for Wenjiang, not for Xingming Zide, right? But if you think about it, right, how can you be a great writer unless you discover the source of creativity in yourself, right? And that, of course, is what the critics of Wenjiang don't see, because that source of creativity is, in fact, quite mysterious, right? And that's what Su Shi had. But that's what Qin Guan is getting. Both of these things are true. Su Shi is political, trying to establish his authority, and at the same time, Su Shi is somebody who develops a philosophy, if you will, of creativity. Now, Su Shi is not so, this is again on slide 6, Su Shi is not so straightforward as you might think. The cultivation of the self is for Su Shi intimately involved with the mastery of human accomplishment through history. Look at what he says here. 天地与人一理也. Oh, that sounds like Chengyi, doesn't it? Right? It's not, but it sounds like him. Well, this is Su Shi's creativity. At this moment, you have to imagine everything. And for the next hour, it's all in your imagination. Okay? The heaven and earth and humanity says, 天地与人都是一理, right? 可是人不会想天地, right? They are things obstruct them. 无有以蔽之也, 变化乱之, 祸福而乐之, 所不可知者祸之, right? And so, if you, okay, there we go, okay. Yeah, there we go. Okay, we're down here. So people don't see correctly. One of Su Shi's jobs, of course, is to help people see. And he writes often about how literature is a way of helping people see what they cannot see. Here's another one. 无一理也, right? If you get the idea, right, of this, if things are a single coherence, if you have comprehended its idea, then you can do any part of it. Doctoring by specialty is the downfall of medicine. Painting by subject is the vulgarization of painting. The doctrine of the great doctors, He and Huang, did not distinguish between young and old. The paintings of Cao Ba and Wu Daozi did not distinguish just men or just things to paint. It is acceptable to say that the best painters and doctors were strong in certain things, but it is unacceptable to say that they were able to do so, but not to do this, but not able to do that. In other words, Su Shi is making the claim, you have to do everything, right? That's part of what he wants to do. Look at how he's going to talk about this in literature, right? 知者创物，能者殊也, right? And then he goes on to 非一人而成也. So it's a tradition. It's an ongoing tradition. Sometimes people create things. Sometimes they just transmit them. Then he says, 自三代立汉之汤而备, right? So this whole field of 文学, right? 世之与子王杜甫, right? One, when you get to Hanyu, Yan Zhenqing's calligraphy, Wu Daoxuan's painting, these are all reached a moment when all possibilities were realized. Because right? The answer, I think, is that he says, just like a doctor who doesn't just cure one kind of illness, but all kinds, so in the realm of culture, I want to do everything. And in fact, that's important to him. Now, in your Zhongwen Gaozi, I have a long exposition which is taken from a book I wrote many years ago called Siwen, which is where I talk about Su Shi's philosophy. But basically, the idea that I want to get across in that is this. To create works of culture that have real value, right? You must, in fact, work through the tradition, right, before you. And it's like going back, he says, going back to the origins of something, going back upstream to the beginning of all the rivers, right, as they flow down and diversify and come into the sea, right? Go back to the origins, and then if you've integrated the traditions, then you can produce new things. And as you look out at the world, right, you can respond to the world with creating things that hold other people together, that they can share. So for him, it's not government institutions that are creating unity in the world. It's people like him who create culture that create unity in the world. They give us things we can share. In any case, I've given you the translation of that passage, but also because I have to keep an eye on time. And I have a lot to cover today, too, so we will... You know, in this, one of Su Shi's followers, famous follower, famous poet is Huang Tingjian, famous for poetry and calligraphy. And Huang Tingjian is famous in poetry, but also in calligraphy because he believes there's a fa, there's a method. Su Shi is not somebody who has a method, right? Su Shi says, well, you know, if Professor Wang says, I always think very carefully before I act, Su Shi says, I act spontaneously. And if Professor Wang says, I act spontaneously, Su Shi says, I always think before I act. He's always going to the other side, right? He's always trying to balance things out, to keep things on an even keel. Huang Tingjian, but he has an idea of how to include, but he doesn't have a method, I don't think. Some people try to give him a method, but I don't believe it. Huang Tingjian has a method, and he says he has a method for composing poetry. And it's a method that's actually not, you would think it's very different from Su Shi. How could he be a follower of Su Shi if he has a method? But the reason is, Huang Tingjian's method in poetry is in fact to try to include the work of earlier poets. So his way of composing a poem is to cite lines from earlier poets, right? Earlier poems, and bring them into his poem and to reflect on them and cite them. It's not just cutting and pasting. It's serious reflection. And so when Huang Tingjian is doing that, he is in fact doing something that's very similar to what Su Shi believes is the role of culture, how you engage in culture. But let me go now to Southern Song. Oh yes, I forgot. This is a very important quote. 应该早，这是苏轼讲的话：“天才之理，为常不易，而不可知。Right? 知其为常之易而莫知之，是机矣。” Right? So Su Shi has all these passages where he says, "天人以理，无以理," right? But then you get this, which he says in his Yi Zhuang, in the Shi Zi Zhuang, commentary on the Shi Zi Zhuang. Yes, things are one. Right? This is the great Northern Song belief. Things are one, things are unified. Right? Think of Fang Quan's big mountain paintings or Guo Shi's mountain paintings. But Su Shi says, yes, they are one, but you can never define it. You can never hold it fast. Right? Again, we fall back on a notion of creativity. All three figures from Northern Song, right? Qi Song, Changyi, Su Shi, see themselves as correcting the field of learning they are in. Changyi is the most radical. After all, he's willing to say that true learning disappeared for 1,400 years until they rediscovered it. Second, their fields of learning exist independently of government. They do not depend on government to exist, and they are not only about criticizing government, right? They are about, in some ways, cultivating the individual. Third point is that the moralists, both Qi Song and Changyi, are far more critical of Wenxue than Wenxue people are critical of moralists, right? Worth thinking about. But all of them are focused on the self and self-cultivation and self-transformation. But how they understand the self is quite different. Su Shi's self is an emptiness into which he fills many things. Qi Song's self is a Buddhist self. There is no self. And Changyi's self is built around the notion of Li as a universal. Let's go to Southern Song. 这个也还有一句话，可是这个不是苏轼的话，这个是《论语》的话，对不对？人人弘道，非道弘人。And I think, although I don't actually, that comes in the 论语, I don't believe it's true to Confucius, but I certainly believe it's true to Su Shi. Now, okay, this is slide 8 we're at now. So and I'm going to talk about a Buddhist monk, Zhu Xi, and a poet, Yang Wanli. 大会宗高, Zhu Xi, and Yang Wanli. So, you know, in Northern Song, and they look back to antiquity to find answers. In Southern Song, they look back to Northern Song to find answers. It's a very interesting phenomenon. Northern Song thinkers all are people who go to Sandai Zhigu, right? Go to the Shengren of antiquity. In Southern Song, they're very happy saying, which of the Northern Song thinkers were right? How do we follow them? Dahui Zunggao is a case in point. He's in the Linji Chanzong, right? Which means that he is at odds with other kinds of Chan, right? As you'll see. His own teacher, the Kejin, was somebody who had actually written a book which he gave to Dahui to defend, called the Linji Jiangzong Ji. Why does it need to have a Jiangzong Ji, right? Because they want to argue that Linji Chan is the only truly correct form of Chan, right? Against other forms. Just like Qi Song, who's Yunmen Chan, right, has argued for his version of Chan. But Qi Song and Dahui, like Qi Song and Kejin, was good at making connections to literati and officials. But now, for him, the problem is not the ancient style, the Gu and Yundong's threat to Buddhism. Rather, it's other kinds of Chan Buddhism. And in particular, he's concerned with the Caodong Chanzong and their notion of Mo Zhao Chan, of silent illumination Chan. And he says here in this quote, and this is on slide 9, in recent years, there's been a kind of heretical teacher who preaches silent ceasing and resting, not daring to make a sound and afraid to waste any time. Often literati, who because of their intelligence and keen aptitude strongly dislike boisterous places, are being made by these heretical masters to do quiet sitting. They see that they can save effort doing this kind of practice and so regard it as correct. They even do not seek wondrous enlightenment, but only regard silence as the highest principle. And he goes further, right, at the very bottom. In recent times, among Chan teachers, there has appeared a kind of heretical Chan. They think enlightenment is a marginal matter, like branches and leaves, exactly because they themselves have never experienced any enlightenment. They don't believe that anyone else has experienced enlightenment either. In other words, Mo Zhao Chan, from his perspective, does not lead to enlightenment. It's just Jingzuo. It's just quiet sitting. It's just contemplation, right? And he says, well, I am giving you the right kind of thing. I am giving you enlightenment, but you have to do it my way. Well, what's his way? We're in slide 10 now. And his solution is what's called the huatou, the notion of a huatou in a gungan. Gungan is something that if you're doing Chan meditation, you sit down and you try to think about, and he doesn't want you to think, he wants you to experience doubts, right? All the myriad doubts are just one doubt. If you can shatter the doubt you have on the huatou, then all the myriad doubts at once will be shattered too. So he's going to give you this huatou, which is only going to be one word sometimes, and say, don't think about it like you think. Don't try to figure it out. Don't use your intellectual mind, right? Just crack yourself on this huatou until it breaks apart. His favorite example comes from Zhaozhou, and Zhaozhou, this is a famous case, Zhaozhou is asked the question, does a dog have a fortune? Does a dog have a Buddha nature? And Zhaozhou's answer is, Wu. That's it, right? And so, what does Dahui says? Zhaozhou answered, Wu. When you observe it, do not ponder it widely. Do not try to understand every word. Do not try to analyze it. Do not consider it to be the place where you open your mouth and say it out loud. Do not reason that is at the place in your mind where you hold it. Do not fall into a vacuous state. Do not hold on to mind and await enlightenment. Do not try to experience it through words of your teacher. Do not get stuck in a shell of unconcern. Just at all times, whether walking or standing, sitting or lying, hold on to this Wu, right? So, if we do that today, we're all done, right? But you can be enlightened first. So when all enlightenment comes when doubts disappear, right? It's a change of state. totally different change of state, an anti-intellectual change of state. And the danger, he thinks, is if you tell people that they already possess a Buddha nature, that they already possess yuanjue, enlightenment, which is, of course, what in Buddhist theory is true, right? The problem, he says, is that they will think it's easy. And in fact, his point is that it's very hard work. So we're talking about, and this will be true for all these Southern Sung people, they're looking for a solution. They think they have it, but they want to emphasize that it's hard work. And Jushi is no different. There he is in postage stamps from the Dalu, right? And Jushi is, of course, is everything. He's a Jida Changji, you might say, as mentioned, spoke of Confucius. He's establishing the Dao Xue, learning of the way, as a powerful source in literati society. He is reworking people like Zhou Duli, taking the notion of Taiji to mean something like Tianli. He's fighting with other people who criticize him, like Liu Zhou-yuan. He does the Sishu Zhangju Jiju. And when I was a student here in Taiwan many years ago with my teacher, even though my teacher was Gongyang Pai, Qing Dynasty Gongyang Pai, we began with Sishu. So today still, right? And Jushi's interpretation of that becomes known by every single educated person into the beginning of the 20th century. Right? That's an extraordinary accomplishment. There's commentaries on other classics. He has a primer, the Jin Lu. His students collect his written comments, 130 chapters in the Juzi Yule, 130 Zhen. He writes a history of his movement. He does the Jali. He comments on prose and poetry. He covers everything. He does, in fact, a new curriculum, right? An extraordinary achievement. And he has a view of politics as well. He keeps telling the emperors, right, who he regards as problems, that he says to them, of course, the Renju Xinzhizheng, the Tiansha Zhishi Wu Yi Bu Chu Yu Zheng. He wants them to understand, right, that the learning of the sages and the kings comes out of the notion of correct governance, correct learning. And in fact, what he's trying to do is make them accept literati learning as something that rulers should have as well. Yes, and then he has another phrase. These are memorials he sends to all the emperors he serves, right? Every time saying the same damn thing over and over again. Learn in the way I tell you to learn. Renju, because, after all, if your mind is correct, then all minds are correct. Again, if you're Renjin Banming, Tianli Suju, right, if you get everything right, everything will be okay. Now, Jushi offers advice on national policy. And here I think, the great scholar Yu Yingshi wrote Li Shi, right? And one of the arguments he makes is that Jushi, in fact, is bringing together Neisheng and Waiwang, right? Internal sageliness and external governance. I'm not so convinced of that. And he sees, that he's becoming a reformer. I think that one of the things that's striking about Jushi that differentiates him from the great institutional reforms of the 11th century, that is Wang'an Shinfa, is that for Jushi, he believes in voluntarism. He believes in Zhiyuanzhi. He believes that local elites should be involved in correcting local society and preferably doing it outside of government control. And so here he talks about having charitable granaries and things like that, at the bottom of slide 12. Jushi, of course, is also, like Changyi, very critical of Wenxue people and Wenzhang. He takes up this phrase in Han Yu's, the preface to Han Yu's Wenji literary collection by his son-in-law says Wenji Guangdao Zhiqiye. Remember, Zhou Duni in the 11th century says Wenji Weni Zai Dao Zhiqiye. the difference between Guandao is Guandao says you use one to hold the way together. It goes through it. It ties it together. It's not just a vehicle for it. And so we have one Guandao, and the student says to Juxi, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this? After all, they talk about Liu Jin Jie Wen, right? It's all one. And Juxi says, no, you're getting it wrong. You're getting it wrong. If you say that one neng guandao, qi or one fan neng guandao zhi li, one shi one, dao shi dao, right? You're missing the point. It's Tao that is supreme, and everything else has to be subordinated to it. He then, as you might expect, sees Su Shi as the great danger. And it is Su Shi that's the danger precisely because Su Shi not only has tremendous influence at the time because his writing is so popular, right? But also because ultimately Su Shi says the Tao is not something you can know, right? The Tao is beyond definition. That's what makes it great. And that is the position Juxi cannot accept. The truth has to be knowable. Language has to be able to communicate it, and we have to be able to follow it. And Su Shi, from his perspective, takes that possibility away. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize in those slides. I'm going to, well, I'll leave that up there for a minute more. Let me check my time. I think I'm going to have to go more quickly and skip a little bit. Su Shi's Yang Wanli, contemporary of Juxi, he knows a lot about Dao Xuan. He's friends with Juxi, he's friends with other people who are connected to Juxi. And Yang Wanli is famous for being part of the Jiangxi Shipai. That is the style of poetry that comes from Huang Pingjian. Huang Pingjian is from Jiangxi, right? But in fact, and he says, poetry is my love. That's what I care about. But then at a certain moment in his life, he says, to close your door, the gates, and just work on your sentences, your couplets. That's not the right way for poetry. You have to go out and you have to see things for yourself. And then he says, Li and Du, Li Bai, Du Fu, famous poets of the Tang, Huang Su Huang, Su Shi, Huang Pingjian, famous for in Beisong, You Dai er Wei Chang You Dai Zhe, Sheng Yu Shi Zhi Yu, right? Weren't these the great sages of poetry? Because in some sense they were dependent on having a method, but didn't have a method. Let's see what makes a poem. What makes a poem? He asks, right? If we look at people who do fa, who are looking for a method, right? Then they put the form first, and they put the way down, the taste second. And if you put the taste second, then what in effect you're doing is you're putting a fa first. So at a certain moment, Yang Wenli says, no fa, right? But of course, Juxi is somebody who's all about fa too, right? So he's looking at the world around him and saying, we have to save poetry from becoming reduced to a method of doing things. And then you see him using this notion of right? Those who are good at poetry get rid of idea. But if you get rid of the words and you get rid of the idea, then where's the poem? You get rid of the words and you get rid of the idea, and the poem is still there. But then, where is the poem, in fact? Well, it's like you drink tea, right? In the beginning, it seems very bitter, but in the end, it seems sweet. It's all about taste. Again, he's moved this back into a more mythical and mystical direction, perhaps. And so another way of talking about it for him is to talk about it in terms of xing, right? That something that stirs people up, something that involves emotional responses to the times. This is a very interesting passage. He says, Mo ye ruchi hao ar baruchi shirji. I am called a Ru, but I am not in fact a Ru, right? He's something else. And yet, he wasn't only a poet. This is one of the things I think that Yang Wanli has been overlooked. Yang Wanli writes a series of essays called Xin Xue Lun, right? Which are about the classics, about the sages, and about their major followers, right? He writes he plays the role of a philosopher when he does this Yangzi Yongyan, right? Calling himself Yangzi and commenting on various kinds of things. He does a Qian Lu Ci is about statecraft, right? And one of the things that's interesting in one of his Xin Xue Lun, he takes up Han Yu's essay Yuan Dao. And Han Yu's essay begins with a passage that Zhu Xi objected to very strongly. Han Yu says, "Ren ni wei ding ming, Dao yu de wei xu wei." Right? In other words, Dao and De are empty concepts to be filled with something versus things that are real in themselves. Right? And he adopts that view as well. He spends around 10 years writing a commentary on the Book of Change. Su Shi writes a commentary on the Book of Change as well. Li Mengyang, who we'll talk about in a minute, writes a commentary on the Book of Change as well. What is it that's about the Book of Change that appeals, the I Ching, right? That appeals so strongly to literary people that they think they have to spend time studying it. They try to figure it out. Precisely because there's something between the natural world and human interpretation that exists, that's in language but not in language at the same time. In writing, so he writes, and okay, I'm going to pass this. What is the change, right? This should be in slide 16, right? What is the E? What is change? E in words is transformation. The E is the book of the sages who comprehended transformation. What is meant by transformation? In my view, yin and yang are the transformations of the supreme ultimate, the Taiji. The wuxing are the transformation of yin and yang. Humans, the myriad things, are the transformation of the 5 phases of the wuxing. The myriad activities in humans are transformations of the myriad things. From the beginning to antiquity today, the transformation of myriad activities had not yet ceased. That's the world that he sees himself in, and that's the role of him as a poet who's engaging the world. Things affect him, and he responds. It's a world of change that he's trying to give people access to. And let's see. His statecraft essays, right, I'm not going to go into them. His statecraft essays turn out to be not about state building, but are about management, about techniques of management, how to be a ruler, how to be a minister, how the minister should control the ruler. And in many ways, they're clever, clever without being deep. Whereas poetry is not clever, but is deep, right? And he says, and an example of this is he begins one of his essays on Jundao, on the way of the ruler, by saying, 有天差之有，有君子之有。天差之有，有其君之不为也。君子之有，君子是有其君之天差之有，有其君之不为也。君有为矣，天差之息，而君子之有也。 other words, people like to have a ruler act and do things. But in fact, for those of us who are his ministers, that's what scares us, right? And this is a big political insight. All the people around Trump who tried to control Trump, right? And he wanted to do, but his followers wanted to just go and do anything, right? In any case, let's go now to the mid-Ming. And I want to look at two people, Li Mengyang and Zhang Ruoshui. There are many people we could look at, but these two strike me as being, this is on slide, we're now into slide 17. Around 1500, Dao Xue, Juxi's learning was important, but it had also become problematic. First Yuan and then Ming made the 4 books with Juxi's commentaries the key part of the examinations, thus equating Dao Xue with Zhu Zixue. The examinations, in effect, made Dao Xue a matter of book learning. This was reinforced in the early 15th century when the court commissioned the 3 Daquan, the Sishu Daquan, Wujing Daquan, Qingli Daquan, right? And yet the books literati were studying taught that true learning involved personal transformation through realizing innate moral qualities. In theory, book self-transformation and self-realization did not depend on book learning in Dao Xue philosophy. And yet, it had become book learning. That's the problem. And there are people who now react against that. In Jiangxi, there's a Wu Yubi who gathers followers and devotes himself to self-cultivation. One of his students, Chen Xianzhang, becomes famous for, in fact, giving up trying to do Ge Wu Zhi Zhi, looking at external things and reading, and focuses inward on the self. And his best student is Chen Xianzhang, who thinks mistakenly that he will inherit the role of the great Dao Xue person of the time. We'll come to that in a minute. But let me begin with Li Mengyang. Now, Li Mengyang, everything I have to say about Li Mengyang was said by Ong Changwei, in his book, Li Mengyang and the North-South Divide, Literati Learning in Big China. And so I can do no better than just to tell you, this is on slide 18, what Li Mengyang what was up to according to Wang Changwei. He had joined the literary circle of Li Dongyang. He had a very tumultuous career. He was always criticizing people in power at court. Not a good idea if you want to have a smooth career. He is a northerner at a time when southerners were more dominant. He had a national view of learning versus a regional view. He wrote 8 essays in 1527. Remember, Wang Yanming dies in 1528. He was a friend with Wang Yanming, but disagrees with him. And where he sets out his own views. He had views of cosmology, of Li and Qi, the Xin, the mind, the Xing, human nature, the emotions, Qing, the classics, the histories, prose, poetry, teaching, learning, everything. In other words, he is setting out an alternative vision. So it's become possible at this point, even though Juxi's 4 books are in the examination system, even though there is what you might call a court orthodoxy, it's possible for a scholar to say, I'll have none of that, I'm going to give you an alternative, trying to produce an alternative to that. Li recognizes, Li makes 2 claims about poetry that appear to be contradictory. One is that poetry is the best way for an individual to express himself authentically and at the same time move others emotionally. And the second is that writing poetry, and Wenzhang generally, requires finding one's models and methods in antiquity. How can both of these things be true? Either literature is going to be an authentic expression of yourself, or you're going to be copying models from the past. He says both things are true. right? So what's his solution to this? How can he say this? Well, he says, there are rules for effective construction of literary works. They are, if you will, pingtai, platforms on which individuals can create variety. These rules have a universal basis. They are not arbitrary, and they are not culturally particular. They are just like the square and the compass. That is why we turn to the earliest works, because they are works where the fa of literary composition was first realized, right? Yet they didn't know that they had a fa. Right? This is crucial to it. We look back at the ancients and we interpret them and see methods and ideas. Just as when we look back at Confucius or Mengzi, we see them talking about Li, but they never talk about Li. It's not a term that's meaningful to them. But we can use that to interpret them. And so we can look to the ancients and see that they in fact have a fa. The second thing about them is that they composed works which achieved social effects. And they survived. Their works survived because they achieved social effects. And they achieved social effects because they were based on the universal rules of composition. And those universals are a pingtai, a platform on which you can create individuality. We're now on slide 19. In Li's view, the I Ching is very important. He points out that this is the one text that never is mentioned in the Sishu, goes beyond the school of Confucius. It's the only classic that applies to all fields of learning, he says. Whereas other classics are each particular to a specific domain. He describes the xiang, the images of the I Ching, as yi hui wang, one thing that gathers multitudes, entities that gather multitudes. It is the only classic that has a cosmology. No other classic has a cosmology, although some people might argue that Hongfan does. It's cosmology built around Qian and Kun and Yin and Yang. There is no need for a discussion of a moral nature endowed in humans alike, because the change offers a way of understanding the complex ways in which yin and yang as the two modes of qi interact. For Li Mangyang, in contrast to the Song Neo-Confucians, the Song Li Xuejia, yin and yang are in competition and in tension, not in harmony. Each is a threat to the other. He argues that the Songren, Buyan Li Wai Zhi, they try to make everything fit by not talking about anything that's outside, beyond Li. Right? The rules of construction of literary construction conform to this binary tension between yin and yang. But it's all qi. And like his contemporary, Wang Tingxiang, Li Mangyang is somebody who believes in the importance of qi, that everything is qi, and thus also that there is inequality in the world. For him, there's reasons to study the classics, but also histories, the first forms of literary genres, again, going back to tradition, defining tradition, right? And finding ways that reflect one's own personality, one's shangxing, what you were born with, your particular personality. In the same way that state and rituals provide ways of engaging with others. Texts are valuable. We learn from them, right? But there's no contradiction between learning from models of the past and self-expression, at least not in his larger vision. And in his larger vision, wenxue and learning, right, are paramount. He writes, the superior man, right, cultivates, well, yes, what is Daozhe, Wu Zhi Shi Ye, right? What does it mean to Zun Dao, right? In this Zun Dao Lu, he writes. It does not mean to seek fame, does not mean to seek profit or uniqueness. It means to cultivate oneself. But then he says, right, Junzi Gui Zhen. It's that authenticity that matters. And if you can arrive at that, right, then no matter if it's shallow or deep, you can still claim to be, to not have missed the way, not have missed the Tao. So we can be participants in this Tao, according to him, without actually being part of a dogma or a school of learning. I want to talk about Zhang Ruoshui. That's just the Yizhi from one of his Shu Yuan. He's famous for building Shu Yuan, a lot of them in Guangdong, right? And Zhang Ruoshui's Kohao, he thought he was going to be the great man. He was wrong. Wang Yangming turned out to be the great man, right? But Zhang Ruoshui lived longer. So that helps, but it doesn't help enough, right? Some people say Zhu Xi became the great man because he outlived all his competitors. No. Wang Yangming died before his competitors, but he ended up being the one who was great. So the Zhang Ruoshui's Kohao was Sui Chu Ti Ren Tianli. In every instance, in every place, realize Tianli, the unity of Li. Right? And Wang Ruoshui says, yeah, 你这个口号还不错, but in fact, you're completely wrong. And you're lost all besides. And you don't understand the dasha correctly, right? And he goes through and sort of takes them apart very politely. But this is in slide 20 we're talking about. Now, Zhang Ruoshui replies and defends himself, but his defense of himself, what makes his defense of himself interesting, is that it's in fact a critique of Wang Yangming. And his critique of Wang Yangming is simple and straightforward. It's basically Wang Yangming's Siju Zhao, the four senses, Wu Shan Wu, Xing Zhi Ti, You Shan You, Yi Zhi Dong, that teaching ends up, right, not paying attention to the outside world. And he wants to have, on one hand, this notion of the Xin and the Xing, because he's going to fall back on this too, as being complete, but at the same time, he wants to have an outside world of things that you have to pay attention to. He wanted internal sufficiency, but still wanted people to pay attention to external things. He says, let's see, I think I have to find my place here. 自古圣贤之学，皆以天理为头脑. Right? So since antiquity, the learnings of sages and worthies have all traded universal coherence as the key, and knowledge and action as effort. You have glossed ge as correct and wu as the emergence of thought. So you, Wang Yangming, say ge wu means correcting your own thoughts. But actually, that's not really what it's about. You are only talking about zun de xin. Honoring following your moral nature. You're ignoring Dao Wen Xue. You're ignoring inquiry and learning. Right? The problem for Zhang was that following Chen Qianzhang, his teacher, he had taken the position that since Tianli is internal, it ought to be possible to activate awareness of it without the book learning and without Chong Wu Zhili, Ge Wu Chong Li, of the Chengdu tradition. Wang Yangming had taken this to a logical conclusion. He identifying with all creation, he Tiandi Wang Wu Wei Ti is his slogan too. One could know what was good or bad about the thoughts that arose within yourself, and you could correct those thoughts and act accordingly. Zhen held to this idea of sufficiency, right? Wu zhi suo wei sui chu, yun zhi sui xin, sui, etc., etc. Held to this idea of self-sufficiency, but still wanted people to pay attention to the external world. I'm going to skip that. And I want to mention that he also does the Xing Xin Shuo. And so he gets, Wang Yangming keeps talking about Xin, right? Li is no longer important. Xing is no longer important. But what Zhang Ruoshui wants to do is restore the notion of Xing, because he wants to restore the notion of goodness, right? He doesn't want good and evil to become relativized. Other things, so that's one way in which he's establishing his own reputation by criticizing Wang Yanming. But he also writes on the classics. I'm going to skip this part. It's in slide 22 if you want to read more about it. And he writes extensively on statecraft. Gowutong. What's interesting about Gowutong is that you recall when we were talking about statecraft on Friday, we talked about Zheng Deshou's Daxue Yanyi, right? Being a Daoshui approach to statecraft which focused on the ruler's mind and ignored Zhiguo Pingtiansha. And Chou Jun in the mid-Ming, who writes the Daxue Yanyi Bu and says, no, you got to pay attention to Zhiguo Pingtiansha in all those ways, right? Zhang Ruoshui's Shengshui Gowutong, Shengshui being the emperor's learning, right, is in fact nothing more than an attempt to restore Zheng Deshou and knock down Chou Jun, right? And say, no, Chou Jun, all these topics in Gowutong look very much like Chou Jun. It's really quite something. You say, oh yes, well he's just doing, Jingshi Zhixue. He's doing statecraft. But when you look closely and read what he says, it turns out that in every instance he's not saying, pay attention to policy outcomes, pay attention to how the process works. What he's saying is, it's all in your mind. It's all in you. You have to make the right decision. So he's gone to great lengths to defend a Daoshui notion against Chou Jun, against those who want to say, pay attention to the outside world, even though he himself, right, in trying to differentiate himself from Wang Yanming, is saying, pay attention to the outside world. My last, so this is another way of, this is his claim for his book, right? It's all surely, he's bringing the word sure. It's not just all Kensai-Juli, it's surely, right? And if you read this book, ruler, you will feel that your heart has Ping Tiansha-Zhili, right? That's, he's getting it to the mind. Nian Nian er zhi yu si, Sun Sun er xing yu si, yi you zhi yu ji, ze ge wu zhi gong xu hu, right? Then you've accomplished ge wu. Let me go to the, I'm going to skip this, okay? Sorry, this is slide 24 if you're interested. More about Gowutong, about his statecraft views. I want to talk about the late Ming, and I want to talk about two people. And one is Yunti Zhuhong, who I'll talk about briefly, and then Feng Menglong, because I've decided I really like Feng Menglong. So you have to listen to me talk about him. And anyway, I had spent a lot of time studying to be able to talk about him. So, Lianshi Zhuhong is a monk in Hangzhou. He is the eldest of the four famous monks of the late Ming, of the Wanli period. He was concerned, above all, with moral behavior. I thought, I've called this category Dao de Xinyang, Dao de Sixiang, moral thought. But I've often thought that I could just call it Dexing, ethical conduct. Because when it comes down to it, both for the Buddhist monks and particularly for Zhuhong, and we'll see. Oh, there we go. Particularly for Zhuhong, the Dexing is really quite central. How people act, right? And he says, what does it mean? His student asks, he says, well, Shidao. What does it mean to Shidao? What's the basis? Is Dexing Weiban, right? I think that's true. And then, of course, this is from his Da Jing to Sishu Ba Wen. So one of the things that Zhuhong is doing is he's also saying that my teaching, right, includes Confucian teaching, but is better. So he is positioning himself always vis-a-vis the Confucians, and that for him very often that has to do with wu sha sheng, right? No killing. No killing is an easy way of putting it. This is in slide 26 for those of you who want to follow that. Zhuhong's fame comes from two things, I think. One is that he is trying to hold together two traditions of Buddhism. One is the Jingtu tradition of Nianfu, right? And the other is the Chan tradition. And he is a great defender of Nianfu, right? And he says this is Shi Yixin, right? And this is Chan, is Li Yixin, right? Both of them, in fact, are not contradictory. They're the same thing, but one is for Jingtu is for dumb people, and Chan is for smart people, right? Which sounds to me like just like the difference between Chen Dehong and Wang Ji when they're talking about Wang Yanming's four-sentence teaching, the Siju Jiao, making that same distinction. One, you got to work hard at, you have to practice Nianfo. The other is you're directly reaching into enlightenment. He has two audiences. He has a Buddhist audience. He's trying to reform Buddhism, and I won't talk about that here much, but he's famous for his work on Buddhist precepts, the Qinggui, the rules for Buddhist monasteries. He does biographies of Buddhists. He's trying to bring Buddhism back to life and make it important again. But he's also trying to redefine what Buddhism is about with this notion of Jingtu and Chan, right? And he's also trying to reach a general public. How do you reach a general public, right? Well, you write, right? You do commentaries, and central to that in his notion of Amida Buddhism is in Amitofo is Fangsheng Chi. If you go to Hangzhou, of course, you'll see the Fangsheng Chi that are there, like this, right? Releasing life societies becomes a major activity of him and ties many people together. It's outreach to society. This is for everybody who wants salvation, he will teach, right? It's going beyond the literati, reaches merchants, common people, literati as well. That's one part of it. And the other part is unusual. He's, as far as I know, the only Buddhist monk who writes and this is his Zizhi, right? But the Zizhi is what's called a Gongguo Ge. It's a morality book. And a morality book that says you can keep score, right, of your good and bad deeds. I think Yun Shi once actually made the point that this sort of fits the merchant culture of the time. But it's an interesting thing. So here we say, you get, rather than saying you get points, she calls them shan. So if you save an animal that's capable of harming people, you get 20 points for everyone you save. A poisonous snake, a tiger, things like that, right? But if they don't have the power to harm people, you only get 10 points, right? And on he goes, right? And then he gives an explanation for why that is, and so on. And this is the slide I use with students. And this is, karmic rewards. This is really good. So I will have time to tell you a story. 我讲很快一个故事。所以我教学生的时候，我说，他们到汪明有这个很多这个公国歌 ，right？ 可是学生我给他们讲这样的东西，他们都笑，哎，我说好，你们觉得可笑吗？好，今天我们是礼拜二上课，礼拜四你回来，我们也要你们都想一想，我今天做了些什么？做了些好事坏事，你要给你自己 points， 然后来报告。And so I did it too. If you do this, it's very difficult. 不是那么容易。但有一些学生还觉得是可笑。可是如果你真正要做的话，你是每天想到你的德行，你总是在想，我是怎么做，你怎么样做。So it's a kind of self-consciousness that goes very well together with Nianfo and with Chan too. Right? I recommend it to you all. Don't eat fish tonight. No meat. Okay. Now here's my favorite. Fang Menglong. Fang Menglong is famous for publishing, right? Everyone knows his Sanyan, right? His famous books of his famous for his attention to Qing, Renqing the Qing, right? But he writes in many, many different fields. Look, Jing Shi Ziji, he has them all, right? He has a very interesting book on his commentary in the 4 books, a lot on the Chunshou, but he takes the Zhangguo period and he turns it into a novel. He has a book of advice on intelligence and smartness. He rewrites plays, 传奇. So he rewrites the Mudan Ting, for example. He does ghost stories. He does jokes. All sorts of wonderful things. And he also actually publishes a lot of things on the fall of the Ming. He's a writer, he's an editor, and he is interested in everything. One thread that runs through his work, let's see, yes, okay, is Qing. And it seems to me that Qing, we have to understand Qing in two respects that are connected. One that we all know is Qing, as Xinyuaile, right? Emotions, right? But emotions are what? Emotions are responses to something, right? There's another meaning of Qing, which you find in the law, right? And that Qing is different from Li. Li is the normative rule. Qing is the actual circumstances. Qing mitigates, right? Li punishes. And if you think about it, these two Qing are very closely connected because your emotions are responses to actual circumstances, what you perceive, what you feel. Right? That's why you have emotions, right? And if we look at Feng Menglung's work, it seems to be it's an exploration of Qing in both senses of this world. He's somebody who's interested in people's love and passions and emotional lives, but he's also a realist who tries to see people in the world as it is. From his perspective, writing stories about love and novels about politics are about ways people relate to each other in reality, with love and affection, but also with jealousy and anger. His Qingshi, right, is a 24 juan. It's the result, he says, of having experienced the transformative power of Qing himself. He now wants others to experience it as well. It is his version of completing the self and completing others. I wanted to collect the best Qing cases from the past and present and do a short account of each so that others would know that Qing can endure, so that they would be transformed from lacking Qing to having it, and thus that the personal Qing would be transformed into the common, so that locality, country, and world all would gladly return to each other through Qing in hopes of change from superficiality. Qing is Feng's universal. If heaven and earth lack Qing, he writes, right? 天地无情, 若无情, 不生一切物. Nothing would be created. The classics teach through Qing. 六经皆清教也. Love is the beginning, as he explains in this longer passage. Qing begins with Nanyu, but it's actually the basis for all the human relationships, for politics and society as well. Begins from that. You know, it has been argued that Feng Menglung was a revolutionary. I actually don't think that Feng Menglung was a revolutionary. I don't think he's conservative necessarily, or reactionary, but I don't think he's revolutionary. I think he's trying to hold it all together again, to hold people together. He writes that, after all, one of the things we want to do, we want people to admire righteousness. We want people to 目以知命, 长其悦, 生其气, 达其凶, 开其无, and 持其因, and so on and so forth. We want to use literature to transform people through their emotions, through appealing to their emotions. And this is the way I would just sum up Feng Menglung, an unrelenting hopefulness, 一种不屈不挠的乐观精神. That is what strikes me that he possesses. Right? This is on slide 33. His first collection of stories, the Gujin Shaoshuo, which is the original title for it, did exactly that. Tries to hold together past and present by reworking the past. And when he does a short version of the Northern Song Taiping Guangji, Taiping Guangji 本来是500卷, 他减少了到80卷, but he shows and the typing Guangji is all sorts of marginal stuff. So 方外的, right? He says, well, how can this be legitimate? He says, well, if you see it in light of Gu and Jin, you see it through history, then what looks like 方外 turns out actually to be normal. And his 小说 are reworking things from the past into the present. But, all the books we've looked at in these lectures are all taking things from the past and reworking them for the present. Feng Menglong, in that sense, is no different from a Sima Guang or a Ma Duanlin or a Zhu Xi, right? It is drawing on the past and reworking it in a way that speaks to the present. All his stories, for those of you, I would suspect that all of you have read some of Feng Menglong, some of the Sanyan, and have a sense that this is true in his stories. He is realistic. So he is realistic. He's thoughtful. He talks about politics, but not really so much about statecraft, except in his one work on Shouning when he was a local official. He does a Gangmu Tongyi, right? Trying to bring together Sima Guang's Tongjian with Zhu Xi's Tongjian Gangmu. His Gangmu Tongyi begins with Pangu, right, in antiquity, the creation of the world, something that neither Zhu Xi nor that Sima Guang did. In his Xinye Guozhi, right, he transforms the story of Eastern Zhou into an historical novel about the struggles between states. For 500 years, he says, right, the power lay in the hands of the Zhuhou. But he has a conclusion, right? If you get the Xian, right, you win. If you get wise and worthy people, you win. But you need power at the same time. And we go on to 34. He compiled another book in Tenzhen, popular book now still, a defense of smartness, of intelligence, right? Again, intelligence is not something that's high on the list of priorities for Daoxue people. For a moralist doesn't need intelligence. They need to be moral, right? And he's saying, what are all the values of intelligence? He goes on and on with stories from the past that show intelligence, right? Lots and lots of 1,000 anecdotes arranged in 10 divisions, lots of subdivisions. He says, if you lack intelligence, you're just a walking corpse, right? This is something you need. There also sells books, of course. And he gives us an example. What is intelligence? The normal person, when they're digging a well, they hit a stone and they say, hit a stone, can't dig a well. The smart person sees that on the other side of the stone is water and digs through, right? That's what intelligence is, to see beyond the obstacles, to see further. And he goes on and makes his case. But somebody says to him, are you telling people to learn intelligence? Is intelligence something of the moral nature, or isn't it something on paper, right? Which is not good, right? And he says, well, he dodged. He said, well, it's inside, but it's inside. That's the shing. But actually, you need to dig it out. That's intelligence. Yes, and then the question is, what are you doing for the age? Is this socially responsible? And right? He says, well, I'm ranking intelligence. I'm not ranking people. It's not just people, but I'm looking at actual events, right? And it's not just events. I'm looking at the intelligence with which they do it, and that doesn't matter who you are. We can take things apart. We don't have to make the confusion of treating people and affairs as the same thing. It's basically an anti-moralist position. Gujin Tangai, where he comes close, I think, to admitting that he's not terribly happy with the world. His friend says, he has a friend write this preface, and he says, if you want to realize yourself in real life, not just Kongyan, but in Xing Shi, going back to that Chunchuo of Confucius, You have to have the learning to do it. You have to have the knowledge to do it. You have to have the da-da, right, the daring to do it. You have to be willing to try and disturb things, but you also perhaps have to be at odds with the world. Feng was neither an iconoclast in what is Oshang Pohuaizhe, but he was not a Daojia either. He wasn't a moralist either. A striking feature of his corpus is that he rewrites earlier works, as I've mentioned, and he uses the vernacular, the Kouyu, right? He uses vernacular. And we could ask, why is this? And many people say, this is because he's trying to reach a broader public in the language that normal people would speak, who have been trained in Wenyanwen. But the other way of understanding it is saying that it's actually still for a literati public, but he's saying, pay attention to the world around you. Pay attention to the lives of other people. I don't know which is the right answer. They're probably both true to some extent. The only classic he writes upon is the Spring and Autumn Annals, which he writes in a way which is very sophisticated. His comments on in the Sishu are very sophisticated as well. So he's writing for different levels about different kinds of matters. And he writes with the Sanjiao Onyan, he writes on the Sanjiao as well. And there he says, the Sanjiao, well, they criticize each other, but you can't get rid of any one of them. And I say, if you could get the idea behind them, then you can use it to order the age. But if you just copy their traces, that's bad too, right? So falling back once again on the idea, which is something we have to interpret. You can call Yao and Shun and Yu, or Shun and Yu, you can call them Ru if you want to. But if you want to call them Xian and Fo, you can do that as well, right? I'm not sure, he says, I fully understood them, but I don't want to get rid of them either. And I'll take something from each, right? I'll take the compassion from Buddhism. I'll take the purity from Taoism. I'll take the practicality from the Confucians. And this is what I mean when I say, get their E, right? And you can order the age with it. But he's not going to commit himself, right? I want to thank you all. Your stories have their beginnings and endings, and a lot can happen in the middle. And so I've come to the end of my story here. But this story didn't begin in the 11th century, where I began. And it didn't end in the 17th century. This is not, in fact, a story about the past at all. It's a story about us today as well. In fact, the impetus for this story came not just from Professor Wang Fan's son's suggestion of the topic, Ruhe Chengwei Wo, Ruhe Chengwei Woman, something that concerns all of these people, as I hope you've seen, right? It began when I was trying to think of, I was charged with the task of leading a committee to find a new form of general education at Harvard 15 years ago. It was then I began to wonder about the question, how do we get students to learn to see how they are connected to others and to their environment? The kind invitation that Zheng Daxue had extended to me in the Luo Jialun lecture series gave me an opportunity, has given me an opportunity to return to this subject at last and to launch a new research project, which you have been kind enough to listen to the beginning of as I try to figure out where I should be going. And after all, all of us, I need to find my own way in this world. Thank you very much.
好，我们非常感谢包庇的教授今天精彩的演讲。那么，我想从他第一场演讲到今天演讲，都可以看得到他的研究方法非常多元，那研究对象也非常包罗万象。特别是今天可以说横跨了我们平常熟悉的所谓文史哲的各类的领域，还包括佛学。那今天在场有很多位专家学者，特别是我们王院士，还有几位宋史的专家。那么一场今天我们大概还有将近20几分钟的时间。不过包教授今天可能会比较累一点，因为他4点半还有另外一场演讲，所以我们尽量时间上控制住，不要拖延。那么麻烦各位发言的时候，请报告一下您的姓名还有服务的单位，谢谢。
I love silence. but I can always call on one of my students here, so to be prepared. Let's see. I think I'll call on Sung Yung Chang.
I can't say I have a very good question, but I will talk.
Bad questions are okay.
So I'll just do some 抛砖引玉 things. From all these thinkers, it seems to me they are so confident about what they know or what they don't know. But we live in a very complicated world. So in the materials you have read or in this research process, I was wondering whether these people ever show their anxieties or uncertainties in the things that they are trying to convince us that they really believe the things should be in that way. Yeah. So this is just my question.
Okay. So, 我们可以用韩语讲，也可以用英语讲，随你们便。可是如果提问题的时候用英文，我是用英文回答。First of all, these are all famous people, right? Famous people tend to be people who have a lot of self-confidence, right? And believe that they are on the right track, right? Even when they change over time. So that's one answer is they tend to have self-confidence, although they have moments when, I think we see this more in Su Shi than others, when he's not certain, when he's depressed and things like that, and he articulates that. Because that's part of giving emotions, right? Part of literature. And I think Fan Menglung is actually willing at a certain moment to say, yeah, he's not happy with the world and what's happening with it. But think about this in a different way. If you think about them as, one of the things I said before is that in my view, 学, learning as a process, it's not just 学习, it's much bigger than that, right? Learning involves three elements. It involves collecting information. It involves organizing that. It involves theorizing, and theorization may be an organization, putting this before that, but it also involves 实践, involves practice, right? And all these people are interested in practice, whether it's the practice of literature, the practice of self-cultivation, the practice of government, right? And in doing that, they are talking to people, to an audience that wants to learn, right? That is confused. As Su Shi says, I live in a world where people are blinded by desires, by confusion, by lack of knowledge. I'm here to help, right? And if you think of them as having a social role that's about practice, then one of the reasons they are famous is because they are able to do those three things: gather information, theorize it, turn things over to practice. And so I think in some ways that that's the part of them that I wanted to talk about. I don't want to deconstruct them and talk about their unhappiness and depression, right? About the fact that Su Shi is sent off to exile, right? And that the wonderful Dumpo Basho that we talked about in the very first lecture, the 8 poems, is written because he almost got executed, right? For making fun of the court. Don't make fun of people with power. They don't like it. You can criticize them. Just don't make fun of them. Don't laugh at them. Yeah. So that's a kind of an answer. How? Wang Laoshi.
I have two questions for Professor Paul. First question is, since you mentioned your experience in reforming Harvard, education, I don't remember. So
general education.
General education. Judging from my understanding of is that you might have put something of your talk today, the content of, if you have the opportunity to put some contents of your talk today to that reformation of Harvard general education, 如何成为我们 from 我 to 我们 any good elements for you future use. That's just come. And second question, the second question is you actually put Feng Menglong's two sides together. One is his study of Chunqiu and Shishu, Gangjian. The other part is other side is Qing. According to your observation, how did he bridge these two together?
So, I only give you one question. Which one do you want? I can't answer either of them very well. So the answer to the first question is at 4:30 today. 4:30 today, when I'm going to talk a little bit about Tongshi Zhaoyu in Harvard. And in fact, many of the conceptions I had go back to that point. When I don't know very much about Dijunghai Wenming, the Sishangshi. My background is in Zhongguo Sishangshi. But I had to teach very early on. I was a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia and had to teach Dijunghai Wenming Sishangshi. And the only way I could do it was to say, which parts are like China? Which parts are like China? And so when I thought about general education, I was thinking about Wenxue, Jingshi Zhixue, Dexing. These are, Wuli Xue, things like this, that are in fact part of Chinese tradition as well. Because I don't think it's only about Chinese tradition, right? I don't believe in cultural uniqueness very much, although lots of people do, I know. But the second question was about Feng Menglong. So yes, I want to do more on the Chunqiu. He writes 3 books on the Chunqiu. One, his Shishu book is actually just Lunyu and Mengzi, right? His Sanjiao book is actually biographies of Wang Yaming, Dao Ji, and Jing Yang. So that's not terribly helpful. I think the question is, when he looks at history, he sees himself as Sima Qian, right? And so he is doing exactly what Sima Qian does, because Sima Qian in the Zishu, right, talks about how he's coming on. That in some sense, Sima Qian is claiming, I follow the Chunqiu, right? I'm following in the steps of Confucius. And I think that one of the ways that, so it's complicated. 张若水也是讲春秋，张若水讲春秋也是否认胡安国。胡安国是在科举教育里面是正式的 ，right？ 是南宋初年的道学家。那么胡安国的张若水是觉得胡安国是不对的，而胡安国他的张若水的方式讲理也要讲事，但是这个方孟龙也是说胡安国是不对的。可是同时他说，可是我知道你们要学习这个胡安国，因为是有这个科举制度，你必得学。所以我给你一本书，也是有胡安国，是同时给你很多别的材料，你可以参考看一看。胡安国是不对的，可是你们要学习。That sort of realism there about your situation. And I think that what is attractive about the Chunqiu is that Chunqiu deals with Qing. In a sense, it deals with actual situations. 所以很早在公羊学派跟讲汉朝的公羊学跟估量学 how were they used? They were used in law finding, right? And 有人说这估量 is basically takes a very li-based idea of the law. That is, if you commit a crime, it does not matter what your intention is. The act is the crime. Even if you didn't intend to do it, you get punished. And the Gongyang says it's not just the li, it's also the qing. It's also the actual circumstances that mitigate that reduce the punishment. And it seems to me that people who are interested in Chunqiu and who reject Huangguo are people who are interested in trying to look at actualities, real experience, real things that happen, and figure out from that. So that's the beginning of my answer. 有点太长的回答，真是。好，是，这是后面的。
哲学系的詹康。
詹康，对，你好。
老师好。我前面听得比较清楚，您那个翻译也比较清楚。那翻译的时候，我听到有一些翻译大概有问题哦，就是像是那个主蒙在那个苏轼那里，那个第一句两个人讲苏轼，但第一个人讲的那个第一句话里面的主蒙是讲这个春秋时代的那个蒙会，但是主是动词。然后和缓之一，那是和缓是两个医生，您知道，但是这个后面的医不是应该不是医生的意思，不是 doctor 的意思，可能是cure 或是 medicine 或是 medication 的意思哈。那再来那个赵州的那个钩子，还有佛性也无。那个赵州和尚语录的话，就是后面就是您引的这个后面 slide 10，后面都不是赵州和尚语录的话了，应该是
I know.
You know, OK。但是因为这里没有出处，所以我
对，那个这个很清楚。潮州的话就是第一句。
对，好，对。那然后这个禅宗语录的语文，我们现在都读不懂了。那我知道有一个词典，禅宗大词典里面有很多这种当时的这种话的解释，您可以看一下，因为这个我也要去查才知道这些话是，比如说举起来的举是这个他们要就是raise the proposition 或是 raise the saying， 然后让那个下面的和尚回答的。在最后就是关于回来到这个苏轼，那个第一个人说的苏轼、欧阳修这个是盟主，然后到苏轼再到，让他们在讲的是这个恢复古文，恢复古文是为了对抗骈体文。
No，
我学到的文学史是这样子的。
No, you can say that, but the point there is Sushir is claiming to be the successor to 欧阳修 and that's the point. 苏轼是有一个欧阳修，然后有我，然后有你们，这个没有提到古文的什么，是文章，that's the issue, right? Who is responsible for leading, setting the standards for 文章？当然他们也是搞古文的，可是不但是古文的，他也是一个诗人 ，isn't it? You don't think so? Okay. Okay, there's another question over here.
Hello. Should I introduce myself?
Yes.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mackenzie Fox. I'm a PhD candidate at Columbia. So I had a question about something that I don't think you explicitly touched on in this lecture, but you did mention in one of your previous lectures, and I think it connects with the material in this lecture. You'd mentioned before, I think, that you felt there was an increasing tolerance for politics, understood as the kind of space for people to disagree about governance and about values and morality as time goes on. So in the Song, there really isn't so much space for this, especially not in the Northern Song, but that by the time you get to the late Ming, there is such a space. Is that something that you did think that or say that, or?
So the way I would phrase it would be that Northern Song thinkers, including Su Shi, the most liberal of them all, want to believe that they can hold it all together. There's some sort of integration and unity.
Okay.
Even if Su Shi says Tianxia Zhili, Tianxia You Yili, Buka Zhizhi, right? You can't hold it fast. So, and that, it seems to me, is not what's going on in the League Ming.
Okay. Yeah, because that was actually precisely the follow-up that I was going to ask, because it seemed to me that when you made the point that, when you said that Su Shi felt that, we can't really know the Li, and therefore can't, in the way of the Tao Xie sorts, explicitly prescribe certain behaviors or something on the basis of knowledge of it, that there is a kind of space opened up for politics by that, because no single person can necessarily claim to know.
But Su Shi can claim, I can absorb all traditions in myself. Right? I can, that sort of notion. And when you have that, then you're not making much space.
Okay.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So that'd be my answer to that.
Thank you. I'm Chi-Shen Chang. I teach at the Department of Political Science, National Chengchi University. I have two questions. The first question is, you choose self as the topic, the thread of your the series of your talks, and by self, I understand that the people you mentioned, they they situate themselves in reference to the people in the past, and try to position themselves as 自我. Right. So the question I have two questions about that. The first question is, how about those people who, by looking back and find himself completely different from people in the past, including the origin, because the examples you mentioned basically are that they say the people before me, they are wrong, but I'm the same as the origin.
Right.
So I'm the true interpreter of the origin. But how about the cases that I reject the origin?
Yeah.
And the second question is,
should we do one question at a time? 可以，第一个问题就先回答吗？ Okay.
The second question is, those who claim that they are the true interpreters of the origin, could it possible that they just construct the image that they are the true interpreter, but in fact they reject it? The way their interpretation actually overthrow the origin.
So this actually gets complicated. So one of the questions has to do with the notion of 断裂, of rupture, right? Do you believe that there is rupture in history? Right? And some people do. Some people argue that a rupture is necessary. But that's a very dangerous position to take, right? How do you justify doing things differently from how they're done now? There are two, in Chinese history, the last 1,000 years, there are two great possibilities. One is, you say, 古代, 三代之古, right? We go back and we interpret the real meaning of antiquity. Wang Shi does that, Su Shi does that, Cheng Yi does that, Deng Deng, right? And they all have different interpretations. So in that sense, they're understanding from a particular point of view. Right? The other great possibility is to look outside, right? To go beyond antiquity and to look at the world outside. That was not an option, really, until the 17th century. It doesn't seem to me. And even then, it wasn't a very successful option until much later, until the 19th, 20th century. So you're absolutely right that so people can accept rupture and still claim continuity. That's the function of antiquity, right? You can jump over the past. But how about people who say, this is all nonsense. You're making it all up, right? There is no antiquity. There is nothing there, right? We don't know what it is. And okay, what do you do then? So if we think about the role, 因为我这个三个角度是不但是何成为我，如何成为我，也是从我到我们，如何成为我们。And that 从我到我们 means practice for other people. How do you guide other people? Right? Do you just say, right? Let's take the case of politics. So suppose we get rid of antiquity. We get rid of the world of our interpretation of sort of the 理想世界, of an ideal world. And we say, there is nothing but politics, and your interests and my interests will negotiate, and we'll go on from there. Yeah? Okay, but why are your interests, why are your interests better? Right? Why does, in the end, justification always requires an appeal to something. Right? And so it seems to me that intellectual politics is always requiring justification. And where you find it is open. The question of what we've seen is that these people find it in different places, to different purposes. That's absolutely clear. But are their interpretations legitimate? Within the context in which they work, their interpretations were found to be persuasive by other people at the time. That's one thing. And the second thing is they were very smart. These are, we're talking about the very smartest people in their society, the most learned, smartest, most talented people. And would they fit in the world today? I don't know. I think some of them do. I think there's still people who do 生命力学 today, right? I think people look back today at Qiu Jun and look at some of Qiu Jun's ideas, and you could argue that in Xinjiang, Qiu Jun's ideas about how to control the ED are still being carried out, right? And there are still people who really value Su Shi. I had, when I first went to Harvard, there was a young woman who had been 在文革的时候被下放了。他问我你是研，我现在刚刚在写一篇文章，是讲苏轼。苏轼我非常喜欢苏轼。我说为什么？说文革的时候我们被下放了，我们是在苏轼的诗跟我们一起，我们是每天读的。And I said, really? Why did you could do that? She said, yes, because Su Shi understood us. 他也被下放了 right? 他了解我们了。So we can always turn to writers from the past, right, and see ourselves better. And as long as that's true, then the humanities, right, and the role of cultural learning, right, will always be with us. And that, of course, I'm aiming that at your president to remind him of the importance of the humanities in general education. 好，我们时间差不多到了吧？好 ，Thank you all very much.
谢谢。